this tendency to view the world through the prism of basically a conspiracy theory version of history, where everything we know is wrong, and if we just are enlightened as individuals, we could go back to the way the world is supposed to work, and with just the Rothschilds and these other bad agents that have caused the problem. Now this is a position I think a lot of people end up with when they don't take a more social view. Is that one of your problems with conspiracy theories as well? I mean, I know you've been kind of reluctant to go down that road. Is that one of the reasons why?
It just puts me in a bad headspace. You know, I've made a dangerous discovery recently. Typically, I will listen to one Alex Jones program a month. And part of that is a conscious decision to limit the amount of Alex Jones material that comes into my consciousness. Part of it is just the fact that, you know, for me to download his show as a podcast, it's a big file. But I've recently discovered that I can just dial a number and tune in to Alex Jones' live stream, you know, and I don't have to download it. I can just stream it over the airwaves through my phone. And I listened to Alex on the way to work, I think 3 days last week. I really struggle with it because, you know, right now Alex is up in arms about a private prison facility that is in Montana, and there's a town in Montana that is now being policed by a private police force, which is composed of foreign mercenaries who call themselves, I think, the Police Force of America or something like that. It's a private corporation, but they have put decals on their Mercedes SUVs that they drive around as their police vehicles that say Hardin City Police. Hardin is the name of this town. And there's a facility being built there, which has been built and is being expanded, which might be one of the so-called FEMA camps, you know, the internment camps for the internally displaced that the government expects to have to deal with in the not-too-distant future. And it's also being called Guantanamo West. And if everything that he says is true, if a fraction of what he says is true, we really should be paying attention to it. But at the same time, if you listen to the 20 hours worth of material that Alex Jones puts out every week, you're going to go crazy. You're going to be a nut job. You're going to be a fanatic who's living in a fantasy world that, you know, might be informed by a few factual elements, but to characterize the entire world according to the evil machinations of a select few that Alex Jones points out, it has you living in a dystopian fantasy world. All dystopian fantasy worlds have little elements taken from the real world, you know, to give them plausibility and make them a convincing virtual environment. But it is a virtual environment nonetheless, and it's one that I choose not to live in. And when I find myself listening to Alex Jones, you know, 3 days a week on my drive to work, I know that I've slipped into a bad habit. You know, it's something that I need to put right.
Yeah, I listen to him, or used to listen to him as well. The thing about Alex Jones that is, as someone who commutes a long way, the thing that's compelling about him is he does a long show, and it's always interesting. And so even if you find yourself outraged by some of what he's saying, you can be assured that you got 4 hours of material there, or 3 hours of material there, that will keep you engaged. And if you have a long commute, that's why you keep listening.
And what's more, I agree with his core message. When you strip out the ranting against conspiracists and, you know, the New World Order and whatnot, like, have you seen the movie Waking Life? The animated? Yeah. So Alex Jones has got a bit in that. He's the one driving around in the car with the PA system on top, just ranting into a microphone. And his message there is spot on. I love it. I support it 100%.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I'm not a critic of Alex Jones.
See, I am a critic of Alex Jones, even though I completely agree with everything he said in Waking Life, and that I appreciate a lot of what he does, and I even believe in some of the same conspiracy theories that he believes in. My problem with Alex Jones is that he is a paleoconservative, not looking at structural problems. He doesn't have a structural approach. He has a conspiracy approach. He believes that there are bad actors that have an agenda, and there are bad actors that have an agenda, but their agenda is shaped by the structure of society. I think we're at a point right now in this crisis where we could be led to a response that's a fascist response. The public could be led through a legitimate desire for change and a legitimate realization of the corruption of the present system into a fascist reaction. And you see it right now. It's happening. The response to Obama is a fascist response. The only protest out there is from the far right. And worse than being far right, it's the incoherent right. And I'm really concerned because I don't feel that there's any living left progressive tradition in this country anymore. The best voices we have against the current system are people like Alex Jones, and he's at heart a reactionary. If you aren't concerned with the core of what you're going at, if you're listening to the surface of this, you can be led astray. Guys like Eustace Mullins, who was on the Gnostic Media podcast, he probably sounds pretty cool to a lot of people who have very progressive concerns about, say, the current banking situation. But his message is truly a fascist one. And you have to be aware of what the underlying agenda is for critics as well as the people who are in power.
I can respond by saying when it comes to conservatives, I'm a lot more favorably disposed to paleo-conservatives than neo-conservatives. I'm very sympathetic to people who, I think like Alex Jones, like to point to the Constitution of the United States and say, look, this huge federal apparatus which is invading every aspect of life is not authorized by the Constitution. The Constitution enumerates a very short list of specific duties and powers that are given to the federal government, and everything else is reserved for the states and for the people. And I think that liberals, particularly elitist, world-saving liberals, are very antagonistic to that message, and I don't support them in that antagonism. And I don't think that's where you're coming from. But I do get the impression, you say that the only opposition to power now seems to be from the sort of lunatic right, and I think it's because a lot of people have bought into this idea that you can just vote for the right guy, put the right guy behind the controls of power, and he'll do the right thing. And we've got our first black president, we've got this articulate, dynamic, really impassioned, soulful person in the position of power, so now everything's fine, and we can go back to celebrity gossip and sports or whatever, or saving the rainforest, or feeding hungry children, and not have to worry because, our team is in control now, and so things are going to get better. Right now we're sort of riding out the repercussions of the bad actor behind the controls for 8 years. But once those lingering effects have sort of faded away, then the nobility and the justice inherent in our savior, Barack Obama, will just naturally shape the society, and that's nonsense. The structures of power, as you say, are the problem. And Alex Jones, I think, is a pretty good advocate for taking apart that creeping kid glove totalitarianism that we really do seem to be facing.
Oh yeah. That's one of the reasons why I listen to him. It's not like every part of his message is something that I disagree with. The thing that's troubling to me most of all is that it's guys like Alex Jones who I feel that are reactionaries, really, at base, are the only ones who are still looking at the overall problem as something that needs to be fixed. The left has just kind of gone to sleep, and maybe it was never awake. But people are waking up to the fact that there's a need for radical change. We have some choices. One of the real easy choices is whether we're going to go into a direction where control and power is more centralized, or whether we're going to try to spread that power out amongst people equitably. And while Alex Jones does not advocate outright any kind of centralized authority, his position, which is essentially pro-capitalist, I think leaves in place the mechanisms of power that lead to highly centralized mechanisms of control. And that's what populist fascism does, is it takes legitimate concerns and flips it into something that the elite can use, the structure that as the capitalist corporate structure can use. And you can see it happening on the streets right now in the healthcare debate. These are people who are really getting screwed, who are out there protesting against Obama's plan, and they ought to be out there protesting against Obama's plan because it's going to screw them more. But they don't know why they're protesting, and they're being led by the pharmaceutical and health insurance industry. They're totally, to the extent that they're not actually phonies, they're actually being completely manipulated by the very corporate structure that's screwing them.